On October 14, 1943, over Schweinfurt, Germany, 291 American bombers crossed the English Channel, cruising at 25,000 feet. By sunset, 60 were lost without a trace. Another 121 limped back home, riddled with bullet holes, shredded wings, and punctured fuselages, some planes carrying over 50 holes or more. Back at secret American facilities, mechanics worked around the clock, patching up metal, reinforcing wings, and adding armor where German bullets had torn through the aluminum. The logic behind this was simple: armor the areas where damage was most severe. But in a classified room at Columbia University, a 41-year-old Hungarian refugee saw something others missed. Abraham Wald, after reviewing damage reports, realized that the conclusions drawn from the data were dangerously wrong. While others focused on the areas of damage that were most visible, Wald saw that the bombers that had made it back home were not representative of the entire picture. The planes they were studying had survived, and their survival hid the most crucial lesson about keeping pilots alive. The critical bullet holes were the ones that didn't show up in the data, the ones in the planes that never returned. The day after the raid, Schweinfurt was left in an eerie silence, one that hung over airfields in England like a thick fog. Ground crews carefully moved around the wrecked bombers, inspecting them with the precision of surgeons. At Grafton Underwood, Technical Sergeant Jimmy Martinez found 47 bullet holes on the right wing of a single B-17. Each puncture was surrounded by twisted aluminum from 20mm cannon shells. The plane had barely made it back. Thousands of miles away, in a nondescript building on Manhattan's Upper West Side, the Columbia University Statistical Research Group operated under the strictest secrecy. The war had transformed academic departments into hubs of military strategy, turning theoretical equations into practical tools that could save lives. In this room, mathematics was the difference between a bomber crew making it home or being lost in enemy territory. Professor W. Allen Wallace, the director of the group, spread out reconnaissance photos on a mahogany table that had once seen faculty wine tastings but was now covered with images of American bombers in their final moments. Milton Friedman, a young but already brilliant economist, traced the damaged patterns with his finger. "The concentration is unmistakable," he said, adjusting his fog glasses. "Wings take the heaviest punishment, while the rear fuselage sections show less damage. The nose areas appear remarkably unscathed." Everyone in the room agreed. The math seemed clear. The bombers were taking most of their damage to their wings and rear fuselage. Therefore, reinforcing these areas seemed like the obvious solution. Engineers were already working on strengthening these parts with additional armor. However, Wald, who had an eye for subtle details, saw the problem in a different light. To him, the bombers that had survived the attacks weren't the ones that told the whole story. They were a bias sample. What was missing were the planes that never made it back, the bombers that were lost in combat, the ones with critical damage in areas that no one had thought to protect. Wald realized the solution everyone was working on was based on faulty assumptions. The planes they were looking at, the survivors, were telling the wrong story. He quietly spoke up, interrupting the discussion. "We're looking at the wrong evidence," he said, his accent cutting through the hum of the room. His colleagues paused. Friedman stopped writing his equations. Wallace lifted his head from the photographs, his expression one of disbelief. Wald, with deliberate focus, went to the blackboard. He began to outline a new approach to the problem, marking the areas of a bomber that had been hit but survived, and explaining how that was misleading the current armor placements. He explained that the planes that came back were not showing the full scope of the problem. The crucial areas to protect were the ones they had overlooked, the parts of the planes that had been hit but had never returned to base. Through his mathematical lens, Wald had discovered a fundamental flaw in the military's logic. The planes they were studying had made it home despite their damage, meaning the damage they could survive was not indicative of where the most dangerous vulnerabilities existed. The solution wasn't to armor the areas with visible damage, but to reinforce the areas where damage might be fatal but wasn't visible in the data. Wald's breakthrough was a game-changer that would save countless lives by shifting the focus away from visible damage and toward the unseen threats. The room fell silent as the weight of realization hit. The mathematical minds that had been focused solely on visible evidence were now confronted with the fundamental structure behind that evidence. The bombers they had been studying had survived despite their damage, yet the bombers that truly mattered, the ones revealing the real vulnerable areas, were scattered across Europe. Their crews were either buried in foreign soil or held prisoner in Stalag camps. 3 weeks after Wald's revelation, W. Allen Wallace found himself walking the humid halls of the Pentagon, carrying a briefcase that contained what could very well be the most counterintuitive military analysis of the war. The April heat had turned Washington into a sauna, but inside the War Department's newly built maze of offices, air conditioning created a cool cocoon where mathematical theories were transformed into operational doctrine. Wallace had requested this meeting not because Wald's insight was particularly complicated, but because convincing military planners to armor the aircraft where damage appeared lightest would require more than just equations. In Conference Room 3 Alpha, Brigadier General Curtis Lame sat across from Colonel Malcolm Moss, the Army Air Force's Chief of Aircraft Modification. Lame's reputation preceded him, much like the contrails of his bomber formations. He was a tactician who had revolutionized formation flying, and was already being considered for Pacific Command. Moss represented the engineering side of air warfare, the practical reality of weight calculations and structural modifications that turned theoretical ideas into operational advantages. Between them, they controlled the decisions that would determine whether Wald's mathematical insight would become military doctrine or remain an academic curiosity. Wallace opened his briefcase with the practiced precision of someone who had learned to present complex ideas to audiences who valued lives saved more than theoretical elegance. Gentlemen, the Statistical Research Group has identified a fundamental error in our approach to aircraft armor placement, he said. He began spreading reconnaissance photographs across the polished conference table. The images showed the now familiar patterns of damage concentration, wings riddled with bullet holes, fuselage sections perforated by cannon fire, aircraft that somehow stayed airborne despite structural damage that seemed impossible to survive. Lame studied the photographs with the intense focus of someone who had personally flown bombing missions and understood the significance of each puncture mark. These images confirm what our damage assessment teams have been reporting for months, Lame said, his voice steady. German fighters are concentrating fire on wing surfaces and rear fuselage sections. Our armor placement should obviously reflect these patterns. This was a response Wallace had expected, even prepared for. Military thinking relied on empirical evidence and practical experience, trusting what could be seen and measured over theoretical ideas that contradicted operational reality. But Wald's insight demanded the exact opposite. Trust mathematical logic over visible evidence, inference over observation, probability theory over common sense. Colonel Moss spread technical drawings across the table, showing detailed schematics of proposed armor placement that matched the observed damage patterns. Wright Field has developed armor configurations that add approximately 800 pounds to the standard B-17 specifications, Moss explained, pointing out reinforcement zones covering the wing surfaces and rear fuselage areas. Weight distribution analysis suggests we can protect the most vulnerable areas without significantly compromising flight characteristics or bomb load capacity. Wallace recognized that this moment would determine whether months of statistical analysis would influence military policy or remain just an academic exercise. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a single sheet of paper covered in Wald's mathematical notations, equations that seemed deceptively simple but represented a complete inversion of conventional logic. The aircraft we are studying represent a biased sample, Wallace began, his voice measured. They returned to base despite sustaining damage. They prove that aircraft can survive hits to wings and fuselage sections. They tell us nothing about the hits that cause aircraft to be lost. He paused, letting the implication sink in. The mathematical analysis suggests we should armor the areas showing the least damage on returning aircraft because those are the areas where hits prevent aircraft from returning at all. The silence that followed weighed heavily, the institutional inertia confronting the mathematical insight. Lame's expression shifted from polite attention to something resembling skepticism. Moss, too, looked up from his armor schematics with the expression of an engineer whose foundational assumptions had just been challenged by abstract theory. Professor Lame spoke slowly, his voice steady but with underlying doubt. You're suggesting we ignore visible evidence in favor of theoretical speculation about aircraft we can't examine because they've been shot down. His tone remained professional, but the underlying question was clear. Why should combat-tested military judgment defer to academic mathematics? Wallace had anticipated this resistance and understood it well. Military culture valued proven methods and empirical evidence over theoretical innovation, especially when lives were at stake. But Wald's analysis wasn't merely theoretical speculation. It was mathematical certainty, as logically sound as arithmetic. The challenge now lay in convincing military planners that mathematical correctness should override operational experience. "The evidence isn't theoretical," Wallace replied, opening a folder that contained detailed statistical analysis of bomber loss rates correlated with mission profiles and target types. Dr. Abraham Wald has developed probability models that account for missing data, aircraft that don't return to provide damage reports. His analysis suggests that hits to engine compartments, fuel systems, and cockpit areas are disproportionately represented among aircraft losses, even though these areas show minimal damage on survivors. Colonel Moss examined the statistical charts with the careful attention of someone accustomed to translating theoretical ideas into engineering specifications. "You're asking us to add armor weight to areas that show light damage based on mathematical inference about aircraft we can't examine," he said. "That's a significant departure from evidence-based modification protocols." The tension underlying the entire discussion had finally been articulated. Military engineering relied on observable evidence and tested procedures, while Wald's insight demanded faith in mathematical logic that contradicted visible patterns. Success would require not only convincing military planners that the mathematics were correct, but also that mathematical certainty should override operational experience. Lame leaned back in his chair, his expression reflecting the burden of command decisions that would determine whether bomber crews made it home or became statistics in German prisoner of war camps. "Professor Wallace," he said slowly, "I need to understand how confident your mathematician is in this analysis, because if it's wrong, we're adding useless weight to aircraft that are already struggling with performance margins. If it's right," his voice trailed off, the implication hanging heavily in the air. "If it's right, we've been making decisions that cost American lives." Wallace knew the moment was pivotal, not just for Wald's analysis, but for the future of military decision-making, where mathematical certainty could be the difference between life and death. But for the larger issue of how mathematical insight could reshape military doctrine, Dr. Wald staked not only his professional reputation, but his belief in the life-saving power of mathematical reasoning. "The logic is mathematically sound," he replied, "even if it contradicts operational intuition." The meeting ended without a decision, but there was an agreement to form a broader review board that would include aircraft designers, combat veterans, and mathematical analysts. As Wallace gathered his notes, he understood that Wald's revelation would face its toughest test not in academic circles, but in the real world, where theoretical elegance had to be proved by its tangible impact on lives saved and missions completed. The expanded review board convened on a gray morning in late April, bringing together those with operational experience and those with academic expertise, combat veterans who had braved the skies above Hamburg and mathematicians who had never heard the roar of a Wright Cyclone engine. Two worldviews were about to collide. On one side stood operational experience, which trusted the evidence that could be seen and felt. On the other side stood mathematical reasoning, which insisted that the most crucial evidence was exactly what couldn't be observed. Major Robert Rosenthal, sitting in the seat reserved for combat experience, was a man who had completed 35 missions over Europe by the age of 26. His B-17, Rose's Riveters, bore scars from flak and fighter attacks, marking the difference between theoretical vulnerability and the brutal reality of combat. Rosenthal wasn't just a statistic, he was a human cost of armor placement decisions. Each modification, he understood, was about more than weight, it was about crew survival rates. Across from him sat Dr. Harold Hotelling, whose work in statistical inference would later revolutionize economics, but today his expertise served military needs. Beside him, Leonard Savage meticulously arranged probability calculations, grounded in decision theory that wouldn't be fully appreciated by peers for another decade. These men believed that mathematical truth existed independently of human intuition, even when it contradicted every instinct honed through combat experience. Dr. Abraham Wald entered the room, carrying a leather portfolio containing 8 memoranda representing months of analysis. His work had evolved from merely challenging conventional wisdom into a comprehensive framework for understanding aircraft vulnerability through survivorship bias. The memoranda, though academic in tone, addressed questions with immediate operational consequences, such as methods for estimating plane vulnerability based on damage to survivors and the sequential analysis of statistical data. General Lamy opened the session by acknowledging the fundamental tension they faced. "Gentlemen, We're here to determine whether mathematical theory should override combat experience and aircraft modification decisions, he said, his voice carrying the weight of command responsibility. Major Rosenthal has flown missions where armor placement made the difference between completing a bomb run and becoming a casualty. Dr. Wald has developed mathematical models suggesting our current approach may be counterproductive. Major Rosenthal spoke with the calm precision of someone who had learned to communicate essential information under the extreme pressure of combat. General, he began, I've seen B-17 wings take 50 hits from 20 mm cannon fire and still keep flying. He pointed to reconnaissance photographs of familiar damage patterns. Engine hits are different. One hit to a right cyclone engine and you're flying on 3 engines with less power and more vulnerability. Cockpit hits? Well, he paused, the weight of the implication clear. That's a game changer. His words carried more weight than any mathematical formula could, as they reflected the real cost of combat modifications. Rosenthal's observation confirmed, rather than contradicted, Wald's mathematical model. Wald, listening intently, recognized that Rosenthal's experience provided crucial data for his analysis, not opposition. Major, Wald said, your observation confirmed the mathematical model. Aircraft that return with wing damage prove that wing hits are survivable. But the real question lies with aircraft that sustain hits to engines or cockpits, the planes that don't return. The response surprised Rosenthal, who had expected his experience to be dismissed by the theoretical mathematician. Instead, Wald was incorporating combat data into a broader mathematical framework, demonstrating a level of sophistication that moved beyond abstract theory and into operational analysis. Dr. Hotelling then spread statistical charts across the table, illustrating loss rates linked to mission profiles, target types, and aircraft configurations. The mathematical analysis doesn't dispute that wing damage is common among survivors, he explained, pointing to data that confirmed observed damage patterns. Rather, it suggests that certain types of damage are disproportionately represented among aircraft losses, revealing a systematic bias in the damage report from returning aircraft. Colonel Moss, looking over the statistical charts, took in the data with the precision of an engineer familiar with translating theory into practical application. Dr. Wald, he said, you're asking us to modify aircraft based on mathematical inference about damage we can't directly observe. That's a departure from our standard engineering protocols. His objection wasn't just about engineering caution. It was rooted in deeper epistemological concerns regarding the balance between visible evidence and mathematical truth. Wald understood that this moment was crucial for establishing the legitimacy of mathematical methodology in military intelligence. Moving to the blackboard, he began drawing aircraft silhouettes, symbols that would become standard in operational research. The mathematics are not speculative, he explained, beginning calculations that would formalize a relationship between damage patterns and aircraft vulnerability. Probability theory allows us to infer missing data from available samples. His equations represented more than abstract concepts. They provided a new methodology for understanding combat effectiveness through statistical analysis. By subdividing aircraft into vulnerability zones and calculating downing probabilities based on observed damage, Wald was creating mathematical tools that could transform military planning. Major Rosenthal, watching the mathematical development unfold, began to recognize that Wald's approach wasn't in opposition to practical experience but rather complemented it. Dr. Wald, he said, your analysis explains something we've observed but couldn't quantify. Aircraft with engine damage rarely make it home, even if the damage appears less severe than wing hits that allow continued flight. This acknowledgement marked a breakthrough, as it shifted the dynamic of the discussion. Wald's mathematical analysis, rather than opposing combat experience, provided a framework for understanding observations that veterans like Rosenthal had made but couldn't systematically analyze. Wald's equations were now providing operational meaning to patterns that had long existed in combat experience but had never been formally analyzed. Leonard Savage presented probability calculations that estimated vulnerability coefficients for various aircraft zones, effectively translating Wald's theoretical framework into quantitative assessments that could guide engineering decisions. The mathematics indicated that armor placement should focus on areas where hits led to aircraft losses, rather than those where hits occurred most frequently among survivors. As the session drew to a close, General LME faced a critical decision, one that would test whether mathematical insight could genuinely reshape military doctrine. The choice was no longer about theory versus practice, but about interpreting the same evidence in different ways. Wald had shown that mathematical reasoning could uncover intelligence that direct observation missed, revealing patterns hidden within available data. In the weeks following the Pentagon Review, Wald's mathematical insight was gradually transformed into operational doctrine through a process resembling academic peer review, but conducted at wartime speed. In his office at Columbia University, now equipped with a secure telephone line and filing cabinets requiring special clearance to access, Wald worked 18-hour days, drafting the technical memoranda that would formalize his approach to aircraft vulnerability assessment. Each document not only contained mathematical analysis but outlined a comprehensive methodology for understanding combat effectiveness through statistical inference. The first memorandum, which introduced a method for estimating aircraft vulnerability based on damage sustained by survivors, established a theoretical framework that would revolutionize military analysis. Wald divided the aircraft into distinct vulnerability zones: engine compartments, fuel systems, cockpit areas, wing structures, and tail assemblies, and then developed probability calculations to estimate downing rates based on damage patterns in returning aircraft. The elegance of the mathematics lay in its simplicity. Areas showing minimal damage on survivors represented zones where hits had prevented survival, while areas with extensive damage proved non-critical for continued flight. Working alongside a team of young women computers who operated desktop calculators with the precision of concepianus, Wald turned damage reports from hundreds of bombing missions into statistical datasets that reveal patterns invisible to conventional analysis. Mary Chen, a Berkeley graduate whose family had been relocated to internment camps while she contributed to the war effort, calculated vulnerability coefficients for B-17 engine compartments. Her work, classified at a level that prevented her from discussing it with her own family, demonstrated how mathematical reasoning could extract intelligence from seemingly random data. The second memorandum tackled the practical challenge of translating mathematical insight into engineering specifications. Wald's sequential analysis of statistical data provided right-field engineers with quantitative methods to optimize armor placement based on weight constraints and performance requirements. Instead of merely recommending protection for engine compartments, Wald developed algorithms that balanced the reduction of vulnerability with operational limitations, creating armor configurations that maximize crew survival probability within acceptable performance penalties. Colonel Moss found himself reviewing engineering specifications that contradicted his decades of experience in aircraft modification. The proposed armor configurations focus on reinforcing engine mounts, fuel system components, and cockpit areas, precisely the zones that showed minimal damage on returning aircraft. In contrast, wing surfaces, which bore the most visible battle damage, would receive reduced protection under Wald's mathematical guidance. This inversion felt counterintuitive, even reckless, but the underlying calculations demonstrated a logical consistency that empirical engineering could not challenge. At Wright Field, the Army Air Force's primary aircraft modification facility, engineers began manufacturing prototype armor configurations based on Wald's vulnerability assessments. The work required developing new installation techniques to protect engine compartments without interfering with maintenance access or cooling airflow. Master Sergeant Tony Kowalski, who had kept B-17s operational through the harsh conditions of English airfields, found himself installing armor in places that seemed to ignore obvious battle damage patterns. "It feels wrong," he confided to his crew chief, "but the math guys say they know something we don't." The first operational test came in May 1943 when the 91st Bomb Group received 12 B-17s modified according to Wald's specifications. The aircraft featured reinforced engine compartments, additional cockpit protection, and fuel system shielding, adding about 600 pounds to their standard configuration. Wing surfaces, traditionally armored based on visible damage patterns, carried reduced protective plating, saving weight for critical system protection. Major James Stewart, commanding the modified aircraft during missions over occupied France, initially approached the new armor configurations with skepticism. His combat experience suggested that wing damage represented the primary threat to aircraft survival, making reduced wing protection seem like a dangerous experiment. However, higher command had become convinced that visible damage patterns were misleading, providing inaccurate intelligence about actual vulnerability. The operational result began to accumulate through mission reports tracking aircraft survival rates across different armor configurations. Modified B-17s equipped with Wald's vulnerability-based protection showed measurably improved survival rates during missions over heavily defended targets. The differences were subtle at first, perhaps a 2% improvement in aircraft return rates, but when aggregated across hundreds of missions, the mathematical precision translated into dozens of crews who returned home instead of becoming casualty statistics. Flight Lieutenant David Williams, whose modified B-17 absorbed direct cannon hits from Focke-Wulf 190s during a bombing run over Wilhelmshaven, provided testimony that validated Wald's mathematical reasoning through brutal empirical testing. The engine compartment armor stopped what should have been a mission-ending hit, he reported during a post-flight debrief. Previous configurations would have lost that engine completely. We maintained power and made it back with all crew members. The accumulating evidence gradually convinced even skeptical combat veterans that mathematical analysis had uncovered patterns hidden within operational experience. Major Rosenthal, initially resistant to theoretical approaches that contradicted visible damage patterns, began advocating for the expanded implementation of Wald's armor configurations. The mathematics work, he acknowledged during a command briefing. Aircraft modified according to vulnerability analysis show improved survival rates, justifying the approach. By the summer of 1943, Wright Field had received authorization to modify the existing bomber fleets according to Wald's specifications. The retrofit program required establishing new production lines for engine compartment armor, developing installation procedures for cockpit protection systems, and training maintenance crews in techniques that prioritized areas showing minimal battle damage. The scale of implementation reflected institutional acceptance that mathematical reasoning could guide military hardware decisions more effectively than conventional empirical methods. The broader implications of Wald's work stretched far beyond aircraft modification, raising important questions about the relationship between statistical analysis and military planning. Wald's methodology offered a blueprint for applying mathematical reasoning to problems where direct observation often provided incomplete or misleading information. His approach demonstrated that operational research, the systematic application of scientific methods to military problems, could uncover intelligence that was invisible to conventional analysis. Dr. Wallace found himself playing the key role of coordinating between academic mathematicians and military planners, both of whom were coming to understand that statistical inference could revolutionize how armed forces evaluated combat effectiveness. The statistical research group's work had shown that mathematical model could extract actionable intelligence from incomplete data, leading to applications in various military domains, from submarine warfare to ammunition logistics. Wald's 8 technical memoranda, which emerged from his analysis, represented far more than just armor recommendations. They firmly established operational research as a legitimate military discipline, and the mathematical techniques Wald developed to understand survivorship bias would influence post-war approaches to medical research, business strategy, and policy analysis. What had started as an effort to improve bomber survival rates had evolved into a fundamental contribution to scientific methodology. As 1943 moved toward its violent end, Wald's influence on aircraft modification policy provided clear proof that mathematical reasoning could save American lives. The abstract equations Wald had crafted in the classified conference rooms at Columbia University were now being applied to bombers flying missions deep into Nazi Germany, protecting crews who would never know that Hungarian refugee mathematics had stood between them and Luftwaffe cannon fire. By January 1944, the strategic bombing campaign over Europe had shifted into a war of attrition that consumed aircraft and crews at rates that threatened the entire operation's sustainability. The 8th Air Force was losing bombers faster than American factories could replace them, despite production lines running non-stop and drawing workers from across the country. In this context, Wald's mathematical approach to vulnerability analysis had grown far more important than theoretical improvement. It had become essential to maintaining operational capacity against increasingly effective German air defenses. The implementation of vulnerability-based armor configurations moved through institutional channels with characteristic military deliberation. While combat crews faced daily missions over targets defended by swarms of anti-aircraft artillery capable of filling the sky with lethal fragments, engineers at modification centers worked methodically to retrofit existing aircraft fleets based on Wald's specifications. The process required balancing immediate operational needs with long-term improvements that would save lives through mathematical precision rather than visible protection. Colonel Moss found himself managing a modification program that challenged fundamental assumptions about aircraft survivability while operating under pressure to maintain mission readiness. Wright Field production schedules involved thousands of bomber modifications, focusing protective resources on areas showing minimal battle damage, an approach that required constant explanation to maintenance crews whose experience pointed to different priorities. The cognitive dissonance was resolved only through accumulating evidence that mathematically guided protection improved survival rates far more effectively than conventional methods. Technical Sergeant Martinez, whose mechanical expertise had kept B-17s operational under the harsh conditions of English airfields, discovered that Wald's armor configurations required entirely new installation techniques. Protecting engine compartments required balancing vulnerability reduction with cooling and maintenance accessibility. "The math makes the work harder," he acknowledged during a training session for maintenance crews, "but the aircraft come back more often with crews intact." The broader transformation extended beyond individual aircraft modifications, bringing systematic changes in how military planners approach problems involving incomplete data. Wald's methodology had demonstrated that statistical inference could reveal patterns hidden within operational data, suggesting applications for challenges ranging from convoy routing to ammunition allocation. The Statistical Research Group found itself consulting on problems that spanned every domain of modern warfare, applying the techniques developed for aircraft vulnerability to questions concerning submarine effectiveness and logistics optimization. Major Stewart, who commanded bomber formations equipped with mathematically optimized protection, noticed changes in crew confidence that went beyond hardware improvements. Air crews flying aircraft modified according to Wald's specifications reported increased morale, based on the knowledge that their protection had been designed through scientific analysis rather than conventional assumptions. This psychological impact complemented measurable improvements in survival rates, providing operational advantages that extended beyond simple vulnerability reduction. The statistical validation of Wald's approach accumulated through mission reports documenting survival rates across various aircraft configurations and operational conditions. By spring 1944, bombers equipped with vulnerability-based armor showed survival improvements that justified the mathematical methodology, even to initially skeptical combat commanders. The differences seemed subtle in individual missions, but became decisive when aggregated across the hundreds of aircraft that made up strategic bombing formations. During the intensive operations leading up to D-Day, when the 8th Air Force flew maximum effort missions against transportation targets across occupied France, aircraft modified according to Wald's specifications demonstrated superior survival characteristics under the most demanding operational conditions. Mission planners who had initially questioned the mathematical approach to vulnerability analysis found themselves requesting additional aircraft equipped with scientifically optimized protection. The practical validation silenced theoretical objections far more effectively than any academic argument. The introduction of long-range fighter escorts, particularly the P-51 Mustang, with its revolutionary range and combat effectiveness, created operational conditions that maximized the benefits of improved bomber survivability. Aircraft that could survive initial attacks long enough for escort fighters to intervene were far more likely to complete their missions and return to base. Wald's vulnerability analysis had anticipated this synergy, designing protection systems that maximized aircraft survivability during the critical moments when escort coverage was either absent or engaged with enemy fighters. Dr. Wallace coordinated between mathematical analysts and operational commanders, who were recognizing that scientific methodology could transform military planning in ways that traditional approaches could not. The Statistical Research Group's success with aircraft vulnerability had established operational research as an essential component of modern warfare, creating demand for mathematical analysis in every aspect of military operations. Universities across America began developing programs to train the operational analysts who would reshape post-war approaches to complex organizational problems. The human cost of mathematical precision became visible through aircrew testimonials documenting survival in circumstances that would have otherwise been fatal under previous protection configurations. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Rosenthal, whose combat experience had initially made him skeptical of theoretical approaches, became an advocate for the expanded implementation of scientifically designed protection systems. "The mathematics saved my crew," he stated during a War Department briefing. "We took engine hits that should have ended the mission, but the armor held." By late 1944, The combined effect of improved aircraft protection, long-range fighter escorts, and tactical evolution had reduced bomber loss rates to levels that made sustained strategic bombing operation feasible. The transformation represented more than just technological improvement. It demonstrated how mathematical reasoning could solve problems that conventional approaches had failed to address effectively. Wald's insight about survivorship bias had become a cornerstone of modern operational analysis, and its broader implications extended into post-war applications that would reshape how organizations tackle problems involving incomplete data. Medical researchers adopted the techniques developed for aircraft vulnerability to understand treatment effectiveness in clinical trials, where patient outcomes could provide bias samples. Business analysts applied survivorship bias methodology to market research, revealing crucial information about competitive dynamics by accounting for failed companies as well as successful ones. Abraham Wald continued his mathematical work with the quiet satisfaction of someone whose abstract reasoning had led to tangible improvements in human survival. The Hungarian refugee, once classified as an enemy alien, had proven that mathematical truth could transcend political boundaries and cultural assumptions. His 8 technical memoranda became foundational documents in operational research, establishing methodologies that would influence decision-making across domains far beyond aircraft armor placement. The war's progress toward Allied victory validated approaches that blended mathematical rigor with operational experience, showing that scientific methodology can enhance, rather than replace, practical knowledge. Combat veterans and mathematical analysts learned to collaborate, creating frameworks that incorporated both empirical observation and statistical inference. This collaboration paved the way for post-war applications in which complex problems demanded both practical experience and theoretical sophistication. As 1944 neared a conclusion, the strategic bombing campaign had achieved objectives that seemed impossible in the wake of Pearl Harbor. American bombers now flew deep into German airspace with survival rates that made sustained operations feasible, protected by armor configurations that prioritized areas where mathematics, rather than conventional wisdom, suggested vulnerabilities. This transformation was not just a victory for Allied military planning, but also for the application of scientific reasoning to life-and-death problems.